Most people think power fears rebellion. They imagine that authority is threatened by chaos, by protests, by violence, by sudden collapse. But history tells a different story. Rebellions are predictable. They rise quickly, they burn loudly, and they are usually crushed just as visibly. What power truly fears is something quieter. Power fears proof. Not the proof that something failed, but the proof that something worked. Because failure can be dismissed, it can be explained away, it can be blamed on circumstance or incompetence. But success creates something far more dangerous. Success creates precedent, and precedent can be repeated. That is where power becomes uneasy. Not when the rules are broken, but when the rules are followed and produce an unexpected result. Because once something has worked inside a system, it becomes impossible to argue that it was never allowed. In the previous chapters of this story, we saw this pattern unfold clearly.
First, we saw how a system could bend without breaking. Hatshepsut did not overthrow tradition. She did not reject legitimacy. She did not challenge the idea of kingship itself. She mastered the system exactly as it existed. She ruled openly, successfully, for decades. And by doing so, she proved something dangerous. She proved that the rules were not as rigid as they appeared, that authority was not fixed by nature, or by gender, or even by tradition itself. It was constructed, and anything that is constructed can be constructed again. Then we saw what happened next. Not a purge, not a revolution, not a dramatic correction. Instead, there was waiting. Stability returned. The administration continued to function. The temples remained active. The state appeared calm and unshaken. Only then did the correction begin. Quietly, selectively, administratively, not to punish the past, but to protect the future. Because systems do not erase people, they erase possibilities.
And this is where the lesson becomes universal. Because this pattern is not unique to ancient Egypt. It appears wherever power needs to appear inevitable. Every long-lived system depends on a story that explains why things are the way they are, why authority belongs where it does, why succession follows a certain pattern, why alternatives are unnecessary or even unthinkable. This story does not need to be true. It only needs to feel natural. It needs to feel ancient, divinely ordered, confirmed by history. Inevitability is the strongest form of legitimacy. That is why systems can tolerate rebellion. Rebellion challenges power directly. It breaks the rules openly. And in doing so, it confirms that the rules exist. A rebellion says, these rules are real, and we are violating them. That makes rebellion manageable. It can be confronted, defeated, punished, remembered as a warning. But a working alternative is different.
A working alternative does not reject the system. It uses it. It operates inside the existing structure and produces a different outcome, without chaos, without collapse, without divine punishment. And once that happens, the story of inevitability begins to crack. That is the real threat. Not resistance, not violence, but repetition. Because once something has worked once,
it can work again. And once people see that, a dangerous question appears. Why not again? Why not here? Why not now? And that question is what power fears most. So the response is never loud. It is never announced. It is never framed as destruction. Instead, it is framed as order, as clarification, as correction, as a return to normal. History is not destroyed. It is edited. Not everywhere, not all at once, just enough. Enough to make certain examples harder to find, harder to reference, harder to defend.
Enough to ensure that future generations grow up believing that the system has always worked the same way, that deviations were temporary, accidental, unimportant, that power always returns to its proper shape. This is why the most revealing acts of control look boring. They look like administration, like maintenance, like record keeping. Someone decides which documents remain visible, which monuments are restored, which names are repeated, which stories are taught. Not to convince the people living at the time. Many of them already know what happened. The real audience is the future. The goal is to control what later generations will be able to cite, what they will be able to point to, what they will be able to use as precedent, to make certain examples harder to find, harder to quote, harder to defend, unreadable, unquotable, unusable. This is why empires do not erase people. They erase possibilities. They do not deny that something existed. They simply make it irrelevant. They leave fragments. They leave gaps. They leave just enough to avoid obvious absence. History is not shattered. It is curated. And this logic extends far beyond ancient history. You see it wherever legitimacy must appear natural. In empires that lasted centuries. In religious institutions that define orthodoxy. In political systems that present themselves as inevitable. In organizations that insist there is no alternative. Whenever obedience is required, belief must be protected. And belief depends on memory. Which brings us to an uncomfortable truth. The past we inherit is not incomplete by accident. It is incomplete by design. What survives is not simply what endured time, but what remained useful to the system that carried it forward. And what disappears is not always what failed. Sometimes, it is what worked too well. This is why Hatshepsut still matters. Not because she was erased, but because she had to be.
Her reign demonstrated that power could look different, without collapse, without chaos, without divine punishment. She did not break the system. She exposed it. And that exposure could not be allowed to remain fully visible. In the final years of her life, nothing appeared broken. Egypt was stable. The temples functioned. The administration worked. The system held. And that was precisely the problem. Because a system that survives an exception can no longer claim that the exception was impossible. Once a structure bends without breaking, it loses the right to pretend it is unchangeable. that was the threat Hatshepsut represented. Not disorder, not weakness, but proof. And proof is dangerous because it can be repeated. It invites comparison. It invites imitation. It invites questions that systems are not designed to answer. If it happened once, why could it not happen again? If authority could take a different shape then, why must it look the same now?
Those questions do not need answers to be disruptive. They only need to exist. So the response was not punishment, it was containment. The system did not deny that Hatshepsut had ruled. It did not attempt to erase her completely. Instead, it narrowed the frame. It reduced her presence to fragments, to partial records, to damaged references. Enough to avoid contradiction, not enough to inspire repetition. And this is how systems survive, not by crushing every challenge, but by controlling which challenges remain visible, not by denying their flexibility, but by hiding it, not by eliminating every alternative, but ensuring that alternatives appear isolated, temporary, and unrepeatable. This is why the most dangerous thing in politics is not rebellion. It is a working alternative. Because rebellion confirms the rules by breaking them. A working alternative confirms that the rules were never absolute.
In the next chapter of this story, we will see what happens when a ruler does the opposite. When someone does not master the system, but tries to destroy it. When tradition is not bent, but openly rejected. When legitimacy is not carefully constructed, but directly challenged. That ruler was Akhenaten, and his failure reveals just as much about power as Hatshepsut's success. If you understand this pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. Not only in ancient Egypt, but in any system that needs to appear inevitable. Because power does not fear collapse. It fears comparison. It fears precedent. It fears proof. Most people never notice this process while it is happening. That is the point. The edits are subtle, administrative, easily explained as maintenance or restoration. Nothing looks dramatic enough to resist. And years later, when someone looks back, the record feels thinner, simpler, cleaner. Not because the past was simple, but because complexity was inconvenient.
This is how inevitability is manufactured. Not by inventing lies, but by narrowing the range of remembered possibilities. Over time, the system no longer needs to defend itself. It only needs to point backward and say, "This is how it has always been." And for most people, that is enough. Once inevitability takes hold, obedience feels natural. Succession feels obvious. Authority feels earned. Alternatives feel unrealistic. Not dangerous, just unthinkable. And that is the final stage of control. Which is why history matters long after the people in it are gone. Because history is not only a record of what happened, it is a map of what is considered possible. And whoever controls that map controls the future choices of everyone who follows it. Hatshepsut's story shows us something rare. Not how power is seized, but how power is maintained. Not how systems fall, but how they protect themselves from successful exceptions. She ruled without chaos.
She ruled without collapse. She ruled without breaking the state. And that is why she could not be fully remembered. Because if her reign were clearly visible, it would invite questions. It would invite comparison. It would invite repetition. And repetition is the one thing inevitability cannot survive. This is the lesson hidden beneath the monuments, beneath the inscriptions, beneath the silences. Power does not fear rebellion. It fears memory. It fears proof. It fears the moment when someone looks at the past and realizes that the present is not the only option. That is why the most dangerous discovery in politics is not a new weapon or a new ideology. It is the realization that something else once worked. If you carry this insight forward, you will begin to recognize it in other places, in other empires, in other institutions, in other moments when the past seems strangely incomplete. Because the pattern repeats, even when the names change.
And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That is why systems work so hard to make sure you never do. The story of Hatshepsut is not a warning. It is a diagram of how power behaves when it encounters a successful alternative. And diagrams, once understood, can be applied again. This is where this chapter ends, and where the next one begins.